ElectricCarPrelab. Study the pages of text in any video before perhaps watching the video, and then keep your eye on the clock readings. Should a point of confusion develop in a video, you can always take the video shuttle control and move it backwards to replay an area of a video. But do realize that if you have issues that cannot be resolved by watching the video more than one time, let's say for example, or a section of it, then make sure that you include clock readings in your cue column of your Cornell notes so as to ask that that be queued up in class and then played there so we can discuss what the confusion may be and try to clear that up. Also, again, whenever you're watching videos or anything that's streaming on the internet, make sure you try to use Wi-Fi instead of your wireless data plans so that you can save your quantity of data for other purposes that maybe you need for other times. As far as the base physical quantities, again, looked at this earlier, there are 7 of them. Those are the base sort of quantities. They can be variables in an experiment, but oftentimes there may be at times where we will actually take and use a couple of these, or maybe 3 of them, or whatever it is, and maybe multiply or divide them against each other and produce then other variables that then might be of interest as well. So when you're establishing an experimental design, you remember again that there are only 2 axes on a graph. Therefore, we want one on the vertical and one on the horizontal. The one on the horizontal will be known as the independent variable. That's a variable whose values are set by the researcher prior to the experiment being run. You don't need to run an experiment to know what values you would use for that variable. And then there is a second variable that would go on the vertical axis. We call that the dependent variable. And that's the one whose values we cannot know prior to the experiment being run or the trial being run. We have to wait and measure them either during the run or after the run, but we can't know those beforehand. Otherwise, there'd be no point to run the trials at all because we'd already know these and those values, and we then plot it out and then get whatever result we wanted. And again, we're trying to find a relationship between these two, the independent and the dependent variables. There are many, many other variables that are typically involved in an experimental situation, some of which we can lock down. And those are known as the controls. Those are the ones whose values we can keep from changing because we don't want anything to affect the values of the dependent variable during the course of an experiment, because then we can't really judge the relationship between the independent and dependent variables. The ones that are really problematic are the uncontrollable variables, which we cannot do anything about. They will change perhaps value over the course of the experimental run, and the big concern there is how that will affect the value of the dependent variable, and thereby muddy the water between as far as the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable that we're trying to uncover by virtue of graphing it and searching out for the equation relating those two. As far as once you make a decision on the variables that are involved, a purpose statement has to be then constructed. It's a single statement that is then targeting the variables, particularly the independent and dependent variables, while acknowledging that we have to pay attention to the uncontrolled and those that are controllable, that are significant, that may affect the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable as far as the graph that would be produced. We then make a sketch of setup, including all the parts of the lab as it's being used, or as it would be intended to be used, and indicating on the sketch the location of the dependent, the independent, as well as the significant controlled and uncontrolled variables in the picture, so that when somebody looks at the picture, they can have a fairly sound idea of how things would be run using that particular setup. There are more details in the lab format guide, so make sure you always check that as you proceed to produce your pre-lab for a particular lab. And again, you're going to not only produce that pre-lab as a draft, you're going to then on a later date, usually the next day, go back and rehearse that so as to be able to be ready to write that in an in-class writing session known as the pre-lab writing for a particular lab. Now, as far as the phenomenon as for the electric car business here, this is what we're looking at. We will have an electric car that we can turn on and run across the table. A few cautions to make sure that we don't hurt the device as we use it. And so now we pick up with the actual motion to be looked at. This will be an example of the phenomenon that will be under study. You have the electric car, the switch is on the front part of the car. Make sure you start and stop the car up off the table so that you don't stress the gearings on the inside when the motor's trying to run but the tires are not allowed to move. Turn on the car, line it up, get ready to go, drop the car, and let it run. And this will be an example then of the type of phenomenon we'll be studying. So some of the issues that remain here obviously will be what sort of technologies will you use actually to measure for the variables that you have identified as your independent and dependent variable, or variables, excuse me, one of each. The idea hopefully is to get at least 10 data points for each one of those variables. And the question is what is the exact nature of those measurements to be made, and what devices are going to be needed to make those measurements. So those are some of the challenges as one considers the purpose statement and then of course drafts the procedure, and of course then visualizing this with the equipment in place. There is no equipment for making measurements shown in this particular imagery, so you have to add that on as part of the pre-lab draft that you would make, anticipating how you would go about collecting the data of interest, and then of course in the post-lab will be when that is processed and analyzed.